Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Office of Indian Education's Annual Performance Reporting, or APR webinar for ARP-AIRE. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll give everyone just a couple seconds to connect. Okay. Right. And we will go ahead and get into today's webinar, and starting with our disclaimer. This presentation was produced under U.S. Department of Education contract number GS00F115CA with Synergy Enterprises, Inc. The views expressed herein do not necessarily represent the positions or policies of the U.S. Department of Education. No official endorsement by the U.S. Department of Education of any product, commodity, service, or enterprise mentioned herein is intended or should be inferred. And of course, we have your program officer, Bianca Williams, with us today. Welcome, Bianca.
Thank you, Casey. Welcome, everyone. I also want to introduce someone else as well, Linda, who will be helping me with ARP-AIRE and transitioning. So you might see her name on emails or calls in the future. But Linda, if you don't mind saying hi. She's a new OIE member, and she definitely has some experience with the rescue plan and special education. So we're so lucky to have her.
Hello. I'd like to just take this opportunity to say I'm looking forward to working with each of you and getting to know you. So thanks a lot.
Awesome. Welcome, Linda. Okay. And then my name is Casey Morgan. I will be facilitating today's session. If you have any questions throughout today's presentation, please place them in the chat, or you can use the hand raise feature. And I'll stop after each section of the APR to give some time for questions as well. So here's an overview of the flow for today's session. We will go over your reporting requirements in detail and cover each section of the APR before wrapping up with some housekeeping. So we'll start with the cover sheet and executive summary, and then we'll talk about part A and then parts B and C from there. Reminder that this year your APR report is due June 29th by 4:30 p.m. Eastern time via the G5 system. Keep in mind that that due date is in Eastern time and that the system will lock and you will not be able to submit after that deadline. So make sure you're aware of what that means for you in your time zone. As you think about
also, sorry, Casey, it is a Thursday. So please remember, it's not the end of the week, it's a Thursday. So that deadline falls on a Thursday.
Yes, thank you, Bianca. Definitely a good note. So on the screen is this year's timeline for your annual performance reports. G5 is open for you to begin entering information. And if you have started your APR process already or have used G5 before, then you may have noticed that it does time out. So as we talk through each section today, I do encourage you to do your brainstorming and planning on documents outside of G5, on the Word documents that we will provide during this session, and then transfer that information into the system when you're ready to submit. That way you don't lose any of your great work. And then between now and your APR due date, that Thursday, June 29th date, your TA team and your program officer will be available to meet, answer questions, and provide the support that you need so that you can submit complete and on-time APRs. So we will share our Calendly link for coaching at the end of today's session. So if you need to schedule a coaching session, please take advantage of that sooner rather than later, and then make sure you're kind of calendaring out the different parts that you need and different things you need from other people on your team prior to that due date. And then in this middle stop, we have the end of your grant year, which is November 28th, 2023. And then you will have an APR update due December 15th, 2023. So you can kind of have a full picture of what your reporting looks like. So what is the purpose of the APR? The APR is a federal grant requirement and is the primary document submitted annually that allows you to document your progress toward project objectives. So what you report is used to determine substantial progress, and that information will inform a continuation award decision. So you want to make sure that you give us complete and detailed information in your APR as you can, and then that you're providing a timely APR update for anything that you reported as a 999. This is the landing page of the G5 system. Remember, this is where you will actually submit submit your complete report. Be aware of any potential system shutdowns for updates or maintenance as you're planning for your APR submission. It will tell you on this homepage here when they'll have the site down for maintenance. Most of the times on here are going to be in Eastern time, so just be aware of that as you're thinking about your own time zone. And then that's also why it's a good idea to submit prior to the deadline when possible. And note that the Eastern time zone applies to the help desk hours as well. So if you have any issues with the G5 system itself, so if you have any tech issues with the system or submitting something in the system, please reach out to the G5 help desk, and you will see that contact information for them on the bottom left of that landing page. And I will make sure you have, here's the website. I'll put that in the chat. Help desk standards hours of operation are 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern time, with the exception of federal holidays. So just be aware of those things if you do need any IT support. If you need any support with content or the nuts and bolts of your actual report itself, then your TA team and your program officer would be the people that you reach out to in that case. Okay. And then before completing your APR, we recommend that you review the APR checklist for your program. And at this time, we will put that checklist document in the chat for you to download. So this is a document that will be helpful to continue to refer back to make sure that you have all of the pieces required for your report. One second, let me get that checklist for you. Yeah, so the checklist is in the chat if you would like to download that document, then you can just have that as a frame of reference. Okay, so some tips for a stress-free submission from us. My first tip is that you complete the cover sheet, download a copy, and then get the necessary authorized signature, and then upload that completed form into G5. You want to make sure that you do this as soon as possible, so you can give your authorized representative an adequate amount of time to get the document back to you to sign it. And you'll need to make sure that you are aware of who your authorized representative is. So remember, your authorized representative is never your project director. So your project director on your cover sheet and your authorized representative should be two different people. If you need help figuring out who your authorized representative is, please reach out to Bianca as quickly as possible so that you can make sure you get that squared away. The authorized representative signature is required for you to have a complete APR report. And we often see grantees submit their APR late or incomplete because of a lack of signature. So make sure you give yourself plenty of time to get that cover sheet signed while you are working on other parts of the APR. That way you're not scrambling at the end or missing the appropriate signature. The second tip is to use that APR checklist that was shared in the chat to make sure that all information is provided correctly and the APR is complete. Even once you feel like your APR is complete, you can pull that checklist out and go through it one by one alongside your report and make sure that you have all of those pieces and that all the pieces are reported correctly. And then the last tip, and I kind of talked about this earlier with doing some brainstorming and drafting outside of the G5 system, but especially for those narrative sections, I definitely would create a separate document or use your project planner and then copy and paste into G5. So particularly for those explanations of progress in section A, which we'll go over in a little bit, and that executive summary. It might also be helpful when we're thinking about the executive summary, even though we are about to go over that as kind of the first section alongside your cover sheet. It is something that you may want to complete after you have done section A. So because it is a summary, that way you're kind of thinking through that frame of reference and you've looked through all your data and all of that. And then Bianca or Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the authorized representative, it has to be an actual signature, correct? Not a digital.
So we've, with COVID, accepted digital, but prefer actual. So yeah, if you can get the actual one, but if, you know, there's no way possible to have the signature, that the digital one has been accepted before.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so these are the reporting forms. The ED 524B is the official APR form used for discretionary grants. And if you've submitted APRs previously, the form will look familiar. We will place the appropriate forms in the chat as well so that you can download the Word document of those if you would like to do your brainstorming or do your writing of your report outside of G5. And you can also access these forms with this link on the slide. And when we send these slides to you, you will be able to click on that link as well. Be sure the expiration date indicates that your form is current. You will know that the form is current because the expiration date in the top right corner should say 7/31/2024. Okay, thank you, Alani. So the link to the forms online is right there for you. And then I'm going to send you the forms in the chat as well. Okay, so you should have those Word documents in the chat and the link to the online forms for you to access those forms, whichever way you prefer. Okay, so the first part of the APR that we will review is the cover sheet. So you can see that there is a screenshot of the cover sheet document on the left-hand side of this slide. The cover sheet document itself is also in the chat if you'd like to look through it as we go item by item here. So for item 1, that's where you enter your unique PR number. Make sure that you include the full number for the grant and that you have the correct PR number. So if you have more than one grant, you'll want to make sure and double check that the number that you are using on this report is the appropriate one for your ARP-AIRE grant. Then we have item 7, your reporting period. The reporting period on this APR should say 11/29/22 to 4/30/23. So that's what you'll put in item 7. And then in item 8, the amounts should reflect what you have actually drawn down. So what you put in item 8 for your budget periods contained in the APR should also match what has been drawn down in G5 as of the reporting period end date. So remember that reporting period end date is 4/30/23. You'll see for 8A, you'll have total drawdowns from the last grant year. So that would be from 11/29/21 to 11/28/22. So that would be from the full previous grant year. And then in 8B, you'll have total drawdowns from 11/29/22 to 4/30/23. And then 8C, you will leave blank. Okay. So we are going to use what we just talked about in terms of item 8 and how we fill out 8A, 8B, and 8C using these numbers. So you'll take the chart on the right. Remember, we talked about they have to match drawdowns, and you'll want to be aware of the reporting dates. So I'll give you a little bit of time to do some math. Sorry, you're doing math on a Wednesday, but I'll give you a little bit of time to do some math to try to figure out what 8A and 8B would be in this scenario, and then we'll go over that. Okay, so you should see the poll popping up there for you. So what belongs in 8A? What belongs in 8B? And then what belongs in 8C? 8A and 8C don't require math, but 8B does require a little bit of math. Thank you to those of you that are getting your answers in. I'll give y'all just a few more minutes. Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and go over the answers. Thank you all for your participation. So, let's go back a slide. Okay. So let's review. So for 8A, you should have said that what you will put in that blank are the total drawdowns from the last grant year. You know, we had a little bit of confusion between whether we leave it blank or we put drawdowns from last grant year. So the answer for 8A is those total drawdowns from the previous grant year. And then most of us did really well on 8B. Remember, you're using your reporting period there to help you, and we're looking at drawdown specifically. So we go back to our numbers here. You should have gotten that 80, 1,725 number, which most of us got. So very impressed. So you should have taken this far right column that's labeled drawdowns and added together the months December through April. So two things there that we wanted to make sure you were aware of, that you were using drawdowns to calculate that, and also that you were looking at those reporting dates. Great job. And then the answer for 8C was nothing, leave blank, which I think all of us got. Okay, so moving on to the rest of the cover sheet. On item number 9, be sure that you are entering the most up-to-date indirect cost information. So sometimes those indirect cost rate agreements expire or other details change when you renew it. So just double check to make sure that you are including the most up-to-date information, and do not skip item 9 if the indirect cost information applies to you and your programming. On item 10, everyone should be marking in A. And then on item 11, everyone should be checking yes and including the corresponding policy as evidence that those securities are in place. So that's something that you would put in the additional information or section C part of your report, is that policy. And then we have the last couple of items on the cover sheet. So that back page, or that second page, on 12, you have performance measure status. And so that's really asking you if the complete data on your performance measures for the current budget period is included in your project status chart. So is complete data provided and included in the section A part of the report? And your answer is going to depend on the data that you have available, and if you will have all of that data, or if you had all of that data prior to April 30th, or if there's still some data that you'll be getting between now and the APR update. So if you say yes on question 12, then you are indicating that all of your data is complete. So then in section A, we would expect to see all of the objectives with current and complete data provided in the report, and there would be no 999s or zeros. If you say no to item 12, then you want to make sure that you put a date when the data will be available. And for your 999 information in section A, that data must be updated and available by the end of the grant year. So by November 28th, and then that's what you would submit in your APR update in December. Okay, who wants to be an APR superstar? So we're going to go through just a couple scenarios to think through whether this fictitious grantee would say yes or no to question 12 based on what we know about it. So this project measure for this example is 100% of students participating in the summer college expedition will complete financial aid forms and application forms for at least 2 post-secondary institutions. And so this summer college expedition happens in June, and then there would be follow-up happening in terms of completing the forms listed in the project measure. So what would this person mark on number 12? Would they say yes or no? You should see a poll popping up. Thank you all for your responses. Just a couple more seconds. Okay, so I think most of us have responded. So based on the information provided, the answer would be no. So this person would want to mark no, and then provide a date before the end of the grant year when this data would be available. So this is a project measure that they would have to update data for in their APR update. Remember that the data that you are reporting in this APR is data that you have from the beginning of the grant year back in November through the end of April, so through April 30th. So if there's something happening over the summer, some programming happening over the summer, and you're measuring those things, or if you don't have like state test data back or things like that, those are things that you would have to provide in an APR update. So then your answer would be no. Okay, and one more scenario to think through. So in this case, 67% of students will increase their reading proficiency by at least 5 points as measured by the beginning and end of year benchmarks. So the end of year benchmark data is data from April. Beginning of year benchmark is data from November. So will they have complete data? So you're just basing it off of just this project measure. So if this is what they're submitting, would they have complete data? Okay, just a couple more seconds to give people a chance to think through it. Okay, thank you all for your responses. This one we did pretty good on. So everybody said yes, and that is the correct answer. So in this case, this grantee would mark yes on their report and provide the data that they have from benchmark testing. Now, the last thing, but as we discussed, one of the most important things on here is that name of authorized representative. So remember, your organization's authorized representative must sign the completed cover sheet, and you must upload that signed document in G5. If you experience trouble uploading your cover sheet to G5, then you can email that completed and signed form to Bianca, but we would really love for you to try your best to upload it into G5 so she doesn't have a bunch of email.
And Casey, one tip for folks on uploading that cover sheet that typically works for everybody is that if you go in and you just try to upload it, that you have done it on your own on the form and you're just trying to upload it, a lot of times you may get an error message. But if you will go into the G5 system, go into your cover sheet, complete everything in the online form, and then download your completed form. You can then take that completed form, get it signed by your authorized representative, scan it, take a picture, however it is that you're going to get your PDF to upload back, but then go and upload it. So complete everything in that online form, then upload your completed form. That typically will keep you from getting any error and get G5 to actually accept your upload. And then the second tip being, remember that it will need to be a PDF in order for it to upload back into the system. But hopefully those two tips, you'll have an easy time completing that cover sheet.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And remember, if you have any technical issues, you can always reach out to the G5 help desk as well. Okay, any questions so far before we move into executive summary? You're welcome to come off mute or place them in the chat. Okay. Well, either it's crystal clear or I put everyone to sleep, both possible. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and dive into the next section, so the executive summary. If you think of any questions as we're going along, you can always pop them in the chat and we will get to them as we're discussing each item. So this next section of your APR is the executive summary. Even though we're covering the executive summary prior to the other sections, you may find it helpful to complete the remaining sections A, B, and C before drafting the executive summary, because those sections kind of prompt you to really think about your year in review and the data and programming that you've done. So it might be helpful to pull all those pieces together. And then once you're in that frame of mind of kind of reviewing your program, sit down and draft the executive summary. The executive summary is a 1 to 2 page narrative description of your program's overall accomplishments and highlights. So I want to reiterate here that even though you want your executive summary to be very detailed, very informative, provide a broad overview of programming, lessons learned, successes, and challenges, that you do need to make sure that your executive summary fits within that 2 page maximum. And you also want to make sure that it is still robust. So you want it to be ideally a little bit longer than a page, but less than the 2 pages. So keep in mind that there is a maximum. If you run out of space in the executive summary and there are some other great things that you would like to share about your program, remember that you can always share any additional information in that section C as well. So it's not that we don't want you to share even more great information. You'll just have to move whatever goes beyond that 2 pages to section C. And then the other thing to note about the executive summary is, although the narrative portions or the explanation of progress from section A may help you think through your project in preparation for the executive summary should not just restate information from the explanations of progress that you provide in section A. So this should be expanding on that information, providing a broader overview of programming. And you can kind of think of the executive summary as a high-level overview that tells the story of your year. And one thing that should be captured in your executive summary is a brief overview of program activities and progress towards objectives. And so we specifically want you to think about how you've met or exceeded your targets, both in the quantitative sense, but also you might have some qualitative data like we discussed in our last talking circle that you may want to include in the executive summary sections or in your explanations of progress. Another more qualitative piece of your executive summary might be how program activities have impacted your participants. It could be specific stories of impact, or it could be, broadly impacts that you've noticed as an organization, and then how you plan to build on your success from the current year. So think about the executive summary as an opportunity to celebrate the work that you're doing every day in your programs and kind of making that work come to life for whoever is reading your report. Okay, so we're going to take a look at a sample executive summary. A couple things to note as you're looking through this example. This is just an example. This is not to say that yours has to look or sound exactly like this. It's just a sample of one way that you could approach the executive summary. And there are a few themes that we will kind of point out and take from it. So first, you can see that the project director has included the PR/award number in the space provided in the top right corner. Make sure that that award number is in all of the appropriate locations on your forms and included, and that it's the correct number for this grant for you. And then second, you'll notice that the summary follows an organization. So the information is organized. You don't necessarily have to organize your executive summary by goals or successes and challenges. That's just a format that I found most helpful in my brain to organize information. But you do want it to be a narrative piece that is organized and has a flow to it that is easy to follow. You don't want it to just be a list or bullet points or copy and paste from other sections. You really want it to kind of tell a cohesive story. And the primary thing about the executive summary really is that content that you include. So you can see in this example, which y'all will have a copy of this example after our webinar today. But you'll see the project director opens up with a broad overview that includes context for the project and general program activities of note. So some things happening in the year that this project director is proud of. You'll also notice that the project director provided successes for each part of the project. So remember, you don't have to format your summary in that exact way, but just make sure that you are including successful pieces of your program, as well as the challenging pieces of your program and how you've overcome those challenges. And you want to make sure that that description is thoughtful and detailed. And you can also see here in this example that when they do discuss successes, they give both qualitative and quantitative data to support their brief overview. So it's not just that data provided in section A, but they really expand on impact. Another element to the executive summary is the challenges that you face, which we've kind of touched on. So if there are project goals and objectives that have not been met this year, or maybe project goals and objectives that you couldn't report complete data on until APR update, this is a great place to discuss some of the challenges that may have affected implementation in those areas or in data collection, maybe some ways that you have adjusted your approach to account for some of these challenges that can give us a more complete picture of your programming and all the great work that you guys are doing. So for instance, one challenge may be hiring. Another example could be connecting students with culturally relevant providers. For any of the challenges you share, I really would encourage you to do some thinking about what might be at the heart of the challenges. So for example, if hiring proved challenging, why was it particularly challenging given the context? Not just it was hard, but thoughtful description about why it was difficult, maybe some things that you've tried to do to address some of those challenges, or maybe you haven't quite figured that challenge out, but you've gained some insight or you've learned a lesson, or maybe you accomplish your goals in an entirely different way. So those are all things that can be shared in the executive summary. And then lastly, in your executive summary, OID wants to know about what contributions your project was able to make to research, knowledge, practice, and or policy. So this could be things that you may have learned from your program evaluation or trends in the data that you've documented along the way. It could also include how you've used data from your program to maybe change practice on a larger scale in your organization, or implications for policy based on data that you have documented along the way. And before we look at an example of challenges being discussed in an executive summary, just a reminder that G5 does time out. So whether you're typing or not. So this is definitely an area of the APR that you probably want to draft elsewhere, and you might want people to chime in on it or be able to contribute to it prior to putting it on G5. So as we continue to look at this example executive summary, this is just that last piece of the other one. So you'll notice too, so this is that page 2 you'll see on the bottom in the circle. It's the other piece was page 1. So you can kind of get a feel for about how long your executive summary should be. You can see that this example is more than that 1 page, but fits within that 2-page criteria and doesn't go beyond it. So as we look at the content of this one, as we talked about with the challenges, we can see that for each project goal, the project director outlined related challenges. And you can also see that the project director also provides how this challenge is prompting an adjustment to practice. So depending on your particular challenge, you may not be able to name solutions for all of them, and that's okay. But when possible, you want to talk about how you have adapted or learned through that. And then at the conclusion of the executive summary, you see a section that describes contributions the program has made. So that captures all of those great things that you should be including in your executive summary. Okay, just to make sure that we're clear on a few of these logistical things, we're going to do a poll in a moment just to check our understanding. of some of the requirements around the executive summary. So the first question is going to be, what is the page length maximum for the executive summary? And then the second part of that, what if you have more information to share than will fit in the executive summary? And that should be popping up shortly. Okay, so you should see the poll. Thank you all for your participation. Remember, when we're thinking about question one, we're specifically looking for the maximum. Okay, just a few more seconds. All right, so most of us were right on, especially on the first question there. So what is the page length maximum for the executive summary? The maximum is 2 pages. And then on that second question, we're a little bit more confused. So for the second question, what if you have more information to share than will fit in the executive summary? That additional information is going to go in section C. Remember, B is for budget. So section B is going to be your budget section. Section C is where you will include all of that additional information that would not fit in your executive summary. Okay, any questions on that portion of the APR? Before we get into the really fun stuff. Okay, we will go ahead and move into section A, which is where your data lives. The purpose of the project status chart is to demonstrate the progress that your project has made towards your approved project objectives. Remember that your project objectives that you report on should be the same ones that you reported on from last year that have been approved. That you'll want to include the exact wording from the previous APR. For all of your project measures, and your reporting data for the current reporting period, which again is 11/29/22 to 4/30/23. You will report on both your GEPR measure and your project measures in the G5 system based on that reporting period that is listed. And then, as we discussed earlier, data that's unavailable now, but will be available before the end of the grant year, before the end of November, is data that you're going to denote as a 999 in the section A project status charts under actual performance data. A 0 is only reported for an objective that will not have data by the end of the grant year. And we'll go through some examples of that as well. So let's turn our attention to the project status chart. So this is what the chart will look like in the system. And this section A really contains the bulk of the information that you will submit in your APR. The purpose is to demonstrate the progress that your project has made toward the approved project objectives in your grant application, like we discussed. And in this section, you're going to provide OIE with both quantitative information and qualitative information toward your objectives. So we kind of talked about that qualitative piece in our last talking circle and some ideas around what that qualitative piece might look like. And that in particular is going to go underneath this chart in those explanation of progress sections, whereas your quantitative data is going to live in this chart under ratio. And we'll talk about what the data specifically looks like in each kind of section of this chart. So there are several components of this chart. First, you have the text of your performance measure. So that's going to be the exact wording of your project objectives. That's where your wording from last year comes into play. They should match. Your objective lives in this box under performance measure. And then you'll indicate if the measure is a project measure or a GEPRA measure. So in this case, you can see it says PROJ, which would be a project measure. And then you have the one GEPRA measure that will be labeled as a GEPRA measure in that drop down there. For your project objectives, you will report the target data and your actual performance data, both as ratios. Remember, for GEPRA, you do not report target, just actual. Then that is where this is where your actual data would go in this ratio column here. Remember, this is where you're putting the 999 over 999 if you do not have the data yet. So you'll still include, for those project objectives, you'll still include your target. It's just on your actual performance data ratio is where you'll indicate 999. And then on that cover sheet, you would have the date that you'll have that data available. And then as we discussed, your qualitative data lives in your explanation of progress, which we'll go into more detail about. So we'll talk about project measures first, and then we'll talk about GEPRA measures, because the GEPRA measure for this grant really requires you to know how you're doing on the other objectives, on your project objectives. I'm going to go over those first, just so you kind of have an understanding of why we're covering it this way. And so your project measures are those that are specific to your grant and show progress that your project has made towards the objectives that were stated in the proposal. You may have changed the wording slightly, but it's the same approved objectives that you measured last year as well. You'll label each of these project measures as PROJ in the dropdown for project. And then what you see on the screen is kind of what your completed chart should look like. So you won't have anything in those other boxes that are blank or that have an X in them. You'll have your project measure text in the box. You'll have the dropdown that says PROJ. And then in those blue boxes around ratios is where you will fill in data. So you'll have your target ratio, and then you'll have your actual performance data. So here's just an example of what a completed chart would look like. So first, like I said, you have that performance measure text that lives in that box. So in this case, this first performance measure for this grantee is each year, the summer college expedition will serve at least 13 junior or seniors attending the LEA. You'll see that that second performance measure on this sheet is kind of related. So, so they've reported them on this one page, which you're welcome to report more than one a page. If you get more than two on a page, then your explanation of progress kind of gets a little weird in terms of being able to fit in all the information. So I would definitely keep it at two. Then you would select on the dropdown PROJ because this is a project measure. Also, because it's a project measure, we're going to include the target ratio. So in this case, my goal was to have at least 13 students that I was getting to sign up. So I'm going to put that goal number over 1. The reason why I'm putting it over 1 is just because it's the same thing as saying 13 students, just as a ratio. And then in my actual performance data, I am putting the actual number of juniors or seniors that are going to be serviced by the program this summer, which would be 15 over 1. And then you have my second performance measure here, also a project measure. I'm also going to report my target data for this measure since it's a project measure. So my goal is that 100% of students participating in this summer college expedition will complete financial aid forms and application forms for at least 2 post-secondary institutions. So remember, my goal for participation was 13. So I'm going to say that my target for this one is out of 13, all 13 would complete those forms. Now, remember what we discussed earlier about this example in particular is the actual event itself, right? It's not happening until June. So then I can't follow up with the students to really get data for that second piece until later in the year. So this is something that I would report as a 999 in G5. And then this is something I would provide in my APR update. So I'm still able to report on how many kids are registered, right? So that'd be that top one, because that process has been complete prior to the reporting deadline, but I won't be able to report this follow-up information because the event is in June. And then you'll see I still talk about in this explanation of progress down here, how I have addressed meeting these objectives. So even though I don't have data for the second measure, I describe when I will have the data available and how I am tracking that data. So even if you do have to report a 999, make sure that you include in your explanation of progress any preliminary data or qualitative data that you have, as well as how you're collecting data and when it will be available. And then for that first one in my explanation of progress, you'll see here that it's a lot of qualitative and kind of process information to understand how we addressed enrollment and we're able to exceed our target. Okay, so now it's your turn. This poll will be a little bit different because it's kind of like a fill in the blank situation. So we're going to see how it goes. We're going to start out with kind of an easy one. You should recognize this measure. And just to kind of give you guys a hint, there will be sections where the answer is that you put nothing in that box. So remember our visual of our chart and where there were X's to indicate that we don't fill that out, and then where we had boxes around information that we do fill out. So it's not a trick. Sometimes the answer is blank. Not all the time, but sometimes. Give everyone a little bit longer to process and think through it. We are going to go through 3 different examples so you can see kind of 3 scenarios that you might have in your report. Okay, like 15 more seconds. And it's okay if you don't know right now. That's why we're going through these examples and stuff, but just do your best. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and go over the responses. So this is what yours should look like. So you should have said that you would leave the raw number and percentage boxes blank. And then the other boxes, you have your project objective, then you have your measure type. So you would put PROJ in that dropdown. Then you have the target ratio. So you'll remember from my example of this, one way that you could report your target ratio is that number of students out of total number of students. In this case, 13 out of 13 is also just 100 out of 100. So that's how I have done the target ratio on this one, because you didn't have a particular number of students to work with in this example. However, if you do, you can report it either way. That means the same thing. And then remember, this is that one that we don't have data for that we just looked at. So this would be a case where we would report 999 over 999. Okay, now we're going to go to kind of a new scenario. And you'll do the same thing. So you'll fill in the full chart. So for this chart, we're looking at another project objective. In this case, 85% of participating high school juniors will enroll in post-secondary education upon graduation. So make sure you pay close attention to when this project director would have that data available. We haven't talked about this situation as much. So I did want to make sure we went over an example of it. So you're thinking through, what would you report for each section of this chart based on this particular objective, which you will have data available for in fall 2024. Okay, I think we're all a little stumped on this one, so I'm going to go ahead and go over the answer. So here we are. This is what you would have said. So those same boxes would be left blank that we saw in the last one. The first two sections are the same thing. You have the objective language, and then you have the measure type, which is that PROJ. And then you still have your target ratio because this is a project objective. So you would take that target directly from the objective text there. So 85%, I could report as 85 over 100, or as we discussed before, you could report as number of students out of total number of students, whichever ratio is easier for you. And then in actual performance data, this one was a little bit tricky because we don't have that data available until summer of 2024. So we wouldn't be able to report that on an APR update this year or in this APR, which is why we would report it as a 0. You still want to explain in that explanation of progress in this case what preliminary data you do have, what qualitative impacts you can talk about. Do students seem more motivated? Are more students applying? Do they discuss kind of what their post-secondary options are more? You can describe kind of preliminary impacts along the way. You can also describe how you're collecting or tracking this data, how you're following up, and then when you would expect to have the data. So you still have that full, robust explanation of progress in this case, but this is a situation where you would have to report 0, and then it would have to be reported in a later APR or APR update once the data is available. Okay, and then one more scenario that is slightly different. So we went through a scenario where we had a 999 situation, and then we went through a scenario where we have that 0 situation. In this case, I will give you a hint and say you can report this data. So you should have information for both your target ratio and your actual performance data ratio for this one. And I'll give y'all a few minutes to think through how you would fill out this chart. For time's sake, we will not do the actual poll, but I'm just going to give you a second to think about it, and then we will go over the answers. So for this measure, we have 75% of teachers will increase their proficiency in culturally responsive strategies by at least 1 level in 3 of 4 categories as measured by an observation rubric. All the observations and their data are completed by the end of April, so prior to the reporting deadline. And in this case, our actual data was at 20 of the 30, or 67% of the teachers accomplished this goal. So in this case, you could report it either of these 2 ways. Both of these ways are accurate. For the target, in either case, the target is 75%, so 75 over 100. And then for actual performance data, you can do the 20 out of 30 teachers. So like we talked about, you can do the actual number of people out of total number of people, or you can do it on that 100 scale, so the 67 out of 100. So you can report that either way. But this is one of those situations where we do have complete data. Okay, I'm going to keep moving forward to cover your GEPRA measure, but if you think of any questions on project measures or section A, feel free to put those in the chat. So for your GEPRA measure, there is one GEPRA measure, and you all will report annually on this GEPRA measure. The measure is the number of grantees that attain or exceed the targets for the outcome indicators for their projects that have been approved by the Secretary. That may be really confusing and hard to follow, but I'm going to break down for you what that means to you. In this case, because it is a GEPRA measure, this is one where you will not fill out the target ratio. You will only report actual performance data ratio. So you'll have a few more blank boxes in this case, and you'll want to make sure that the measure type does reflect the GEPRA measure. So this is what that GEPRA measure means to you. You're going to put the total number of project objectives in your APR that you met or exceeded over the total number of project objectives defined in the APR. So that is not necessarily the number of objectives that you had like actual data for, but your total number of project objectives. So if it is a project objective that is listed in the APR, then you would add that up. Those are your total number of project objectives that would go on the bottom there, or be the second half of the ratio. And then that top number, or the first half of the ratio, is your total number of project objectives that met or exceeded those target ratios. So you would have to go through and count those up. So that's also why we talked about GEPRA after. It might be easier to go through project measures and then count that up to figure out what your top and bottom number would be. Okay, so here you go. You have the full language of the GEPRA measure in the box. Then you have it indicated in measure type that it's a GEPRA measure. And then you have filled out the actual performance data. So in this case, there were 10 project objectives. 3 were met or exceeded at the time of this report. So my ratio would be 3 out of 10 for this GEPRA measure. And then I would include my explanation of progress. Remember, because it's the GEPRA measure, you will not include a target ratio. So your completed GEPRA chart would look something like this. So let's talk about those explanations of progress in a little bit more detail. When you are writing your explanation of progress, you will want to provide both qualitative and quantitative data that gives the reader insight, not only about whether or not your goals were met, but also provides insight about the background and context under which you are operating, as well as the challenges that you overcame. And then in the narrative explanation of progress, you should demonstrate how you have met or made progress toward the measure. And if it was not met, this is also an area where you can provide an explanation of why, or talk about upgrades that you might be making to your programming or your processes. And this is also where you will need to describe what your ratios are measuring. So what data are you collecting? How did you collect this data and how are you tracking it? And then how are you then analyzing it for impact? You're also welcome in this section to briefly describe related activities and accomplishments for each of the measures. So this is just broadly some explanation of progress to look for. You can kind of keep in the back of your head as you are drafting your explanations of progress. They should provide detail about the reported quantitative data. Your explanations of progress should be clearly linked to each listed measure. So everything that goes in your report in that chart section should have some type of explanation of progress along with it. And you want to make sure that how you are attaining this data and compiling it for reporting is understood through your explanations of progress as well. This is an example of an explanation of progress. So we've seen a few examples, but I'm just going to point out this one just to reiterate some of those look for. So you'll see it's very detailed. It talks about when we will have data. It talks about how we are meeting our goal. So in this case, for the GEPRA measure, I talk about how many of the target outcomes we've met or exceeded. And then I describe, for 2 of the other ones, we're missing data. Here's when we expect to have data. Here's how we are working towards that target outcome and measuring and tracking towards it. I also talk about some challenges in certain areas where maybe we didn't meet or exceed, and an upgrade. So an upgrade to our collection and reporting procedures. Okay, and we're going to skip the actual poll for this, but kind of same things that we've been discussing. Remember, if you do report a 999 over 999 or 0 over 1, that you want to make sure that in your explanation of progress, you include whatever preliminary data you have, you include how you're collecting data and when you expect to have that data. And then for your 999 information, that's data that you will update in your APR update in December. And then for this one trips people up sometimes because of the wording, but which is not a good tip for writing your explanation of progress. And I will let you guys answer that. A poll should be popping up while I go over a couple of things for APR updates and provide you with a second to kind of catch your breath and, oh, pretend you didn't see that. So what is not a good tip? Sarah, I think that's the wrong poll.
Is it still showing?
It's like section C.
Sorry, it's having a moment.
Just a, pre-quiz, a pre-check.
There you go.
Okay, so while we're pulling that up, remember your APR update is due at the conclusion of your grant year. So that would be December 15th for y'all this year. And it's an opportunity to update that section A data. So that section that we just went through, the APR update, unlike the APR itself, is submitted via email. So remember that distinction. Your APR update should be submitted in G5 and your APR update is submitted via email. And we will talk about APR updates more, but just to kind of give you a heads up. Thank you to those of you that are answering the poll. Remember, you're trying to select the tip that is not a good writing tip. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so the answer is that the bad tip is keep your response brief and to the point. So you do want to tell the story behind your quantitative data. You do want to use section C for any information that won't fit in the explanation of progress box. Remember, section C is that additional information section for anything that would not fit elsewhere. And you do want to make sure that you include an explanation of progress for all measures, even those with no data currently. So we want your explanations of progress to be robust and detailed. Okay, so B for budget. So you'll use the section at the top there to write a narrative that describes all spending for the current project year, ideally by budget category. Remember, for your budget information, you are providing information about funds expended and drawn down through G5. So through the last day of the reporting period, which was 4/30/23. You'll want to discuss your G5 drawdown frequency. If it's applicable to you, why did drawdowns not happen at least once per quarter? And what have you done to try and remedy that situation? So how are you tracking expenditures independent of your budget office? What are some changes you've been making to ensure that money is being spent? So you want to make sure that you include all of that information in that section B. If you anticipate that you will have any unexpended funds remaining at the end of the project year, you'll also need to discuss in section B how much funding you anticipate remaining, why you think you'll have it remaining, and then what your plans are for that money. Please, please, please make sure that you guys are spending your money and that you have a plan for any money that you still have. So in regards to carryover, we do want you to make every effort to use your allocated funds in appropriate ways prior to the end of the grant year. So if you need to do a budget revision after you submit your APR based on the data that you're looking at for your APR, please do that. But please make sure that we are really spending that money and getting creative but appropriate about how we're spending that money. If it is the case that your project will have any carryover, for the following year, then you need to indicate the portion that you would like to carry over in the budget section and describe how you plan to use those carryover funds specifically. So even if you say you're going to move it to a category, what is it covering? What are your plans to make sure that that money gets spent? And you'll also need to describe any changes you wish to make in the grants activities for the next budget period. So if you're adding anything or you plan on moving money around, you want to make sure that those things are consistent with the scope and objectives of your approved project application and that it is laid out in this section. You also have this budget reporting tool, which you will be provided a copy of after today's session as well. When you're using this tool, you only fill out these yellow sections here that you see on the screen. All the other fields will auto-calculate. So they will be locked. Do not be alarmed. Do not try to unlock them. And you don't need to report on specific line items, just the overall categories themselves. So the personnel, fringe, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, other, and indirect. And then you want to make sure that you complete both the narrative and numeric fields. If you need help with budgeting or filling out the budget form, we can always help you with that as part of coaching. In those justification columns, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like after this. In column F, rationale for available funds, you want to provide a narrative to describe why you have the amount in column E available or remaining and how you plan to expend those monies during the remainder of the current grant year. So how do you plan to spend that money in that category between now and the end of November? Column I is intended use of the remaining funds beyond the grant end. So that's going to be that last narrative column. So you're going to want to provide detail on where you plan to use any potential carryover funds in the next grant year. And remember, this detail should be specific and should paint a full picture of your plans for the funding. This is just an example of what this might look like. If you have carryover and if you intend to use that carryover in that category, then you need to make sure that there is an explanation under intended use of the remaining carryover funds. In this case, this person said they were going to do a budget revision to move what would have been carryover funds from personnel to another category. And then in that category, they explained what they would do specifically with these funds. You'll also see in the rationale column, like we described, they have specific explanations for why that money is remaining. Okay, so if I'm looking at the chart on the screen right now, remember that we're only filling out those columns that were yellow on the other side. And thank you, Sarah, put that optional budget form in the chat so you can download that right now if you would like. So as we're looking at this chart, the sections that you would fill in are those B, C, D, F, G, and I. So you will not put anything in A, E, or H. E and H will auto-calculate for you. Those totals at the bottom will also auto-calculate for you, and the budget categories are already in the tool for you. Any questions on budget? Okay, so section C. Remember, this is that additional information section. You have two pieces to this. There's this kind of narrative portion here, and then there's also the optional section C reporting tool, which we will talk about. So in the final section, section C, that's where you get to include any information that either did not fit into sections A or B, or any additional information that didn't have a home elsewhere. So you might include photos, student work samples, news clippings, blog posts, accolades from other agencies or organizations, really anything to highlight your program and paint the most complete picture, so that your program officer can really understand what your program has been doing this year and how you've been making impacts on kids. So as far as some additional information that you can consider including is any documentation that highlights success stories or challenges, kind of some of those things I listed off on the previous slide. You can provide any other appropriate information about the status of your project, including any unanticipated outcomes or benefits. You can also include information that would not fit in the executive summary or section A. And for section the section B and C, you'll want to upload everything as one PDF. So you'll want to combine all those documents that are additional information into one PDF and then upload that one PDF. And if you do need help with that, that is also something that we can help you with. This is that section C reporting tool. So we'll briefly walk through some of these items. So again, at the top, kind of your usual information, your grantee name, the PR award number, and who your project director is. Then we move into grade levels served. So you'll check all of the applicable grade levels that your project serves. You'll put the total number of unique students served. So that's both during the reporting period as well as anticipated during the grant year. So reporting period would be students served through the end of April, and then anticipated during the grant year would also include any additional students that might be added to programming as the year continues. Then we have what percentage of time does your project director devote to this grant, how many staff work full-time on your project, and how many staff work part-time on your project. Something to note here is that part-time does not necessarily mean that they work part-time for your organization. They could work full-time for your organization, but only part-time on your ARP-AIRE project. So that's really what it's getting at, is the percentage of time that is devoted to this project specifically. Then all applicable times that you are offering services. For many of you, it's probably one of those situations where you would check multiple boxes again. All applicable methods of services that you provide. Hybrid would be any service that's provided as both a virtual and in-person kind of blend situation. You'll list all services provided this grant year. You'll list any language learning that is provided and the applicable language if that applies to you. If not, then you can put in A. Any evidence-based strategies that you've used specifically in your program that have guided your success, partners and their current status, whether they are active partners or inactive partners, and then any key personnel changes. If you've made no changes personnel-wise, then you would just state no changes in that section. And then the last few questions on here, how do you plan to sustain program activities beyond the federal funding period? Describe any planned changes to project activities for the remainder of the project year. So anything you plan to change between now and that end of November time period. And then in like one sentence, you're going to briefly state your greatest project success for this reporting period and your greatest project challenge. Okay. So we won't do the poll, but I do want you to think about it, and I will review the answer to this again. But how should you submit sections B and C? So think about how we are submitting sections B and C. Right. And remember, for sections B and C, we said that you're going to upload all of section B and C as one PDF. So you're going to combine all your documents into one PDF and upload that into G5. If you are having any issues with figuring that out, we are happy to help you on a coaching call. Okay, and the last couple of things that I have are just some upcoming events, housekeeping, reminder type of things that we will get through pretty quickly here so you can have the rest of your day. So the form is already in G5 for the cover sheet. Once you complete it, print it for signing, and then re-upload it as a PDF. You have your section A in G5. And then things that you'll upload into G5 would include that signed cover sheet, your executive summary, and then you have your section B narrative and optional budget reporting tool, as well as your section C narrative and optional section C tool, which would become one big PDF that you would upload to G5. Just a note on continuation awards. OIE makes every effort to process all continuation awards by the start date of your anticipated budget period. However, grantees who do not submit on time, have missing information, or have not made substantial progress may experience a delay in receiving continuation awards. And then OIE will update you about any carryover requests, but remember, you should not assume your carryover requests are automatically accepted or approved. Okay, couple of reminders to go over. Remember, G5 is open for reporting. Only the grant project director of record in G5 may submit the report. So while you may be working on it with other people, you will need to be aware that you as the project director will have to submit the report in G5. So make sure that you have all necessary components prior to the June 29th, 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time deadline. And then another thing to be aware of is make sure that you do finalize and submit your APR. Do not leave your APR in draft form. Sometimes that can be confusing. You want to make sure that you have actually submitted it. If it doesn't give you that date and time stamp of your submission that has not been submitted, and a way that you can double check that is by, once you think you've submitted it, log out of everything, log back into the system, and then go and make sure that you have that date and time stamp for your submission. Okay, in case you didn't get the due date one more time, Thursday, remember it's a Thursday, June 29th, 2023 at 4:30 Eastern Time. And then your upcoming events, you do have a talking circle on August 16th. And then we have office hours on June 29th and July 27th. And we will put this Calendly link in the chat for you. Oh, thank you, Alani. So Alani put the Calendly link in the chat. If you do need some support with submitting your APR, I recommend that you make sure you book a coaching session and that you do that with plenty of time, because just be aware that the next office hours date is also the day that your APR is due. And so you don't want to wait until then to ask your questions. Okay, and we will pop up that end of session poll for you. I just have some information about new grant competitions and the project director meeting. And other than that, and completing this poll, that is really it. So if you could please make sure that you complete the poll while I just go through the project director meeting and the new grant competitions so that you guys are aware. So remember, the project directors meeting is coming up. So as you're completing today's poll, I just want to remind you all about this year's project director meeting. Remember that you're required to attend as a project director, but everyone on your entire team can attend. So invite your entire team, invite your budget people. There's going to be some great sessions and presenters there. And then if you have not already registered, we will put that registration link in the chat for you. And then 2 grant competitions that are out. There's the STEP grant competition. There's a pre-application webinar for that June 1st. So tomorrow. And then the proposals for that are due July 3rd. And I will put the link to that grant competition in the chat. And Craig, yes, I'll make sure you're that registration link. Oh, thank you, Sarah. Okay, so Sarah beat me to it, but PD meeting registration link is in the chat. So if you guys do need to sign up for that or send the link to someone who needs to register, make sure you grab that. I did put that STEP grant competition in there. And then Olani put the NATRE competition in there, which is this grant. So the Native American Teacher Retention Initiative is a new grant opportunity. Those pre-application webinars will be June 12th. And then the proposal is due July 3rd for that one. All right. Thank you all so much for your attendance and your participation. Remember, if you need help with your APR, we are happy to help you. Please sign up for a coaching call. Otherwise, you're always welcome to email us at oie@seiservices.com. We will see you at your next event or in coaching. Thank you all so much for coming and your participation today. And we look forward to helping you have a successful and as stress-free as possible reporting season. Excuse me. Not recording. Thank you, Chris.